The most powerful manufacturing nation on earth cannot convince its own people to go shopping. Think about that for a second. The country that builds more solar panels than the rest of the world combined is watching those panels pile up in warehouses. The country that produces more electric vehicles than any other nation on the planet is offering deeper and deeper discounts just to move them off the lot. Factories are running at full capacity and wallets are running on empty. Welcome back. Today we are going to talk about something that most financial media simply skips over because it unfolds too slowly for headlines and too quietly for breaking news alerts. What is happening inside China's economy right now does not look like a crisis from the outside. There are no bank runs. There are no emergency press conferences. The official numbers still show growth. But underneath those numbers, something is grinding that has not stopped grinding in over 3 years, and the longer it grinds, the harder it becomes to stop. And here's the thing that should make you pause. We have seen this movie before. Not the Japanese version that everyone always talks about, a different version, an older version, one that ended with the entire world being pulled into its consequences. Let us start from the beginning. Between the year 2000 and 2020, China ran the most extraordinary industrial expansion in modern history. Average annual growth in industrial output hit 9.6% across those 2 full decades. To put that in human terms, imagine a factory that doubles its output roughly every 7 years for 20 years straight. China went from assembling cheap textiles to manufacturing the backbone of the global technology supply chain. It built more high-speed rail than the rest of the world combined. It poured more concrete in 3 years than the United States poured in the entire 20th century. The world called it the Chinese economic miracle, and the world was not wrong to be impressed. But here is the number that nobody was paying enough attention to during those miracle years. While industrial output was growing at 9.6% per year, domestic demand, the actual ability of Chinese households to buy things, was growing at only 4% per year. The machine that was building everything was growing more than twice as fast as the market that was supposed to absorb everything. Year after year, for 2 full decades, the gap between what China could produce and what Chinese people could actually afford to buy got wider and wider. The surplus got exported. Global trade absorbed it. The system held together because the rest of the world was buying. But what happens when the rest of the world starts closing its doors? That is not a hypothetical question. That is the situation we are in right now. Here is a question for you, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments below. Do you think China's overcapacity problem is something that can be solved through exports and trade deals with developing nations, or does the solution have to come from raising incomes inside China itself? Write your honest answer below, because the response to that question determines everything about what comes next. Now let us talk about what the data actually shows, because the data has been telling a very consistent and very uncomfortable story for quite some time. In January 2023, China's consumer price index fell below the moderate inflation zone of 2%, and it has not returned since. That is over 3 years now. In January 2026, the CPI came in at just 0.2% year-on-year, which was significantly worse than analysts had expected. The producer price index, which measures what factories charge each other, has been falling for 39 consecutive months as of the end of 2025. Not one bad month, not 2 bad quarters, 39 months in a row of factories cutting their prices just to keep selling. Goldman Sachs analysts project that this producer price deflation will continue through 2026 and potentially into 2027. That is potentially 5 straight years of factories bleeding margin every single month. If you hold savings in a bank, that lends to Chinese manufacturers, you are sitting in a system where the collateral those manufacturers hold is worth less today than it was when the loan was made, and the margin on their business is thinner than it was last year and the year before that. If you have investments tied to Chinese real estate, you need to understand that household debt as a share of GDP actually fell in China in 2025 for the first time in decades, and that sounds positive until you understand it means households are paying down debt because they are frightened, not because they are prospering. Scared people do not buy apartments. Scared people do not go to restaurants. Scared people save, and the more they save, the less the economy moves. Now let us talk about the man whose job it is to fix this, and why his situation is one of the most genuinely impossible economic puzzles of our time. Pan Gongsheng became governor of the People's Bank of China in July 2023. His task, in simple terms, is to restart consumption in an economy where households are frightened and saving at record rates, while factories are producing at full capacity for goods nobody has enough money to buy. Every tool available to him creates a new problem somewhere else. If he cuts interest rates to encourage borrowing, households do not borrow because they already watch their apartments lose value, and they do not trust that taking on debt right now is a good idea. If he pumps money into the banking system, the banks lend to state enterprises and industrial companies which use that money to produce more goods that China already cannot sell domestically. And if he does nothing, the deflation spiral tightens another quarter turn. This is not a policy failure. This is a structural trap that was built over 20 years of choices, and there is no quick lever that gets you out of a 20-year structural trap in 1 or 2 fiscal years. Let us now make the overcapacity problem concrete, because the numbers are staggering and they need to be translated into something real. China's solar panel manufacturing capacity at the end of 2025 was estimated at approximately 1,200 gigawatts of production per year. Total global demand for new solar installations in 2024 was approximately 270 gigawatts. This means China's factories can produce more than 4 times what the entire planet needs in a given year. Not 50% more, not twice as much, 4 times. Imagine a water bottling plant that can fill 4 million bottles a day in a city that drinks 1 million bottles every day. The 3 million extra bottles sit in a warehouse that costs money to rent. Eventually, the warehouse is full. Eventually, the company starts selling the extra bottles at a loss just to keep the lights on. Eventually, the workers making the bottles start getting paid less because the company is bleeding. And then those workers buy fewer groceries and fewer clothes and fewer of the products that other factories make, and the spiral moves outward like a ripple in still water. China's retail sales in November 2025 grew at just 1.3% year-on-year, which was the weakest reading since 2022 and significantly below forecasts. Home appliance sales in that same month fell 19.4% year-on-year. A government trade-in subsidy program had pulled some demand forward earlier in the year, and now the hangover from that was showing up in the data. When you use government money to borrow demand from the future, you still have to pay it back, and November's numbers were part of that bill coming due. Youth unemployment in China peaked at 18.9% in August 2025. By December 2025, it had eased to 16.5%. That is still nearly 1 in 6 young people between 16 and 24 who are outside university and cannot find work. And this matters. for everything we are discussing, because young people who cannot find jobs do not buy apartments, they do not buy cars, they move back in with their parents, and they spend as little as possible, and they wait. And the longer they wait, the more the consumption gap widens and the more the deflation digs in. If you're saving money for a down payment on a property, right now, stop for a moment and ask yourself what the trajectory of property values in your target market actually looks like when the generation that should be buying properties cannot find stable employment. The math on that question is not comfortable. Now, let us talk about the invisible force in this story, because it is not a person and it does not have a face, but its consequences are as real as any decision made in any government building. The invisible force here is the compounding logic of deflation itself. It works like this. When factories cannot sell their goods at profitable prices, they cut prices to stay competitive. When they cut prices, their profit margins shrink. When margins shrink, they reduce wages or cut jobs to survive. When wages fall or jobs disappear, households spend less. When households spend less, factories sell even less than before, so they cut prices again. Each turn of this cycle makes the next turn easier to begin and harder to stop. The producer price index in China fell 2.6% across the full year of 2025. That is, every factory in China on average receiving 2.6% less for the same goods than the year before. Multiply that across an $18 trillion economy, and you're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of margin simply evaporating from the productive sector in a single year. And 2024 was also negative, and 2023 was also negative. This is not a blip. This is a direction. In September 2025, the consumer price index fell 0.3% year-on-year, which was worse than forecasters had predicted. In November 2025, private investment fell faster than government investment, which is a signal that the business community's confidence in the economic outlook is genuinely fragile. In December 2025, GDP growth came in at 4.5% year-on-year, the weakest quarterly reading in 3 years. Each of these data points on its own is manageable. Together, they form a pattern that has a direction, and the direction has not changed. Let us now talk about the deadline, because there is one Nomura analysts projected at the end of 2025 that China's GDP growth would slow to 4.3% in 2026, with moderate deflation persisting through the year. Goldman Sachs projected producer price deflation continuing at around negative 0.7% through 2026. These are not catastrophe forecasts. They are forecasts of a slow, persistent grind. But here is the deadline. Embedded in that forecast, the Chinese government has set its internal economic targets around a growth rate of approximately 5%. Every quarter that comes in below that target is a quarter where local governments have less tax revenue and less land sale revenue, and therefore less ability to fund the social services and infrastructure projects that keep employment stable in smaller cities. The fiscal squeeze at the local government level was already acute in 2025, and it gets more acute the longer the deflation persists. The deadline is not a single date. It is a cumulative pressure point, and every quarter adds to the pressure. If you hold bonds or any financial instrument with exposure to Chinese local government financing vehicles, you are in a segment of the market where the revenue base is shrinking and the debt obligations are not. Now, let us talk honestly about what comes next, because there are 3 realistic paths, and they lead to very different places. The first path is the realistic baseline. Deflation continues at its current slow pace through 2026 and into 2027, as Goldman Sachs projects. The government continues to run modest stimulus programs. Youth unemployment stabilizes, but does not dramatically improve. Household savings rates remain elevated. The economy grows at somewhere between 4 and 4.5% officially. Manufacturing overcapacity is addressed very slowly through consolidation and some exits. This is not collapse. This is a slow, persistent drag on living standards and a continued compression of corporate margins and a continued export of deflation to the rest of the world through cheap Chinese goods flooding global markets. It is painful but manageable in the short term and structurally corrosive in the long term. The second path is what happens if the external demand shock intensifies before the internal consumption gap closes. If the United States and the European Union escalate tariffs further, and if developing nations that were absorbing Chinese export surplus begin to push back with their own trade barriers, then the export release valve closes faster than China can build domestic demand. In this scenario, the producer price deflation accelerates rather than stabilizes. Factory bankruptcies rise. Local government fiscal pressure becomes acute enough that services are cut and social stability becomes a concern. This path does not require any single dramatic event. It just requires the external environment to tighten by another 10% while the internal situation stays where it is. The math on this path becomes genuinely destabilizing within 2 to 3 years. The third path is the one nobody is discussing publicly, but the mathematics allows for. China has an extraordinarily high household savings rate. Chinese households collectively hold enormous amounts of money that they are not spending. If a genuine structural reform were implemented that gave households more confidence in the social safety net and more protection for their wages and working hours, that pool of savings could be activated relatively quickly. Consumer demand in China does not need to be manufactured from nothing. It exists. It is sitting in savings accounts waiting for a reason to feel safe enough to move. If policy shifted decisively toward protecting labor and reducing the working week and strengthening the social insurance system the way the United States did in the 1930s with its labor reforms, the domestic demand picture could change faster than most forecasters currently model. This is not the likely path under current political conditions, but the mathematics allows for it, and it is worth understanding that the solution is not physically impossible. It is politically difficult. Where are you watching this video from? Right now. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I'm always curious where this community is located around the world. Here is what this all means at the level of the individual person rather than the aggregate economy. If you are saving money in any financial institution with significant exposure to Chinese property developers or Chinese industrial loans, you are in a system where the collateral is deflating and has been deflating for several years. That does not mean the institution fails tomorrow. It means the margin for error is thinner than it was and thinner than the official ratings suggest. If you are running a business that competes with Chinese manufactured goods in any category, from solar panels to steel to consumer electronics, you are competing against suppliers who are in many cases selling below their cost of production just to maintain market share. That is not a temporary competitive disadvantage. That is a structural pressure that will continue for as long as the deflation spiral persists inside China. If you are an investor, watching Chinese economic data, and the official GDP number is the only number you are looking at. You are looking at the least informative number available. The producer price index and the retail sales figures and the youth unemployment rate are telling a story that the headline GDP number is not. We are watching the largest manufacturing economy in human history work through a fundamental mismatch between what it can build and what its own people can afford to buy. We've watched this movie twice before at meaningful scale, once in the United States in the 1930s and once in Japan beginning in the 1990s. Both times it took over a decade to work through. Both times the rest of the world felt the consequences in ways they did not fully anticipate, and both times the eventual resolution required structural changes that were politically very difficult to make. The final question I want to leave you with is this, and I want your genuine answer in the comments, because this one has no clean answer. And I've heard smart people argue passionately on both sides. If you were advising the government of China right now, would you prioritize protecting export competitiveness by keeping production costs low, or would you prioritize building domestic consumption by raising wages and shortening working hours, even if that made Chinese goods more expensive globally? One choice preserves the factory model that built modern China. The other choice tries to build the consumer society that sustains it long-term. Both carry real risks. Both have historical precedent. Write your answer below. I will be reading. Thank you for watching. If this gave you a new way of thinking about what is happening, hit the like button and subscribe so you do not miss the next piece of this story. We are just getting started.